Okay, tonight we're going to talk about the developments and details of World War II and the build-up to World War II. So you should be doing Cornell notes, number them number 9, objective 9, title them World War II events. And you should have on the left-hand column key ideas. In the right-hand main section, you should have supporting details. You should skip lines in between key details. And then you should have a summary at the bottom, so make sure you reserve the last 4 lines for a summary. Okay, so in January 1933, Hitler becomes Chancellor of Germany. Remember, he was not elected. Rather, President Hindenburg was sick and selected him to be Chancellor. So we have a quote. Naturally, the common people don't want war, neither in Russia, nor in England, nor in America, nor in Germany. That is understood, but after all, it is the leaders of the country who determine policy, and it is always a simple matter to drag the people along, whether it is a democracy or a fascist dictatorship, or a parliament or a communist dictatorship. Voice or no voice, the people can always be brought to the bidding of the leaders. That is easy. All you have to do is tell them they are being attacked, and denounce the pacifists for lack of patriotism and exposing the country to danger. It works the same in any country. So this is a quote from Hitler, and this should resonate with you from today's documents about how Britain and Germany and the German people were not excited to go to war and did not want war. But it was Hitler who wanted war, and so there was war. So here we have a political cartoon. Take a look. We have the spineless leaders of democracy. And some of them have names. We have rearmament. He's rejecting Treaty of Versailles. And Hitler is just fiddling his way all the way to the top to be the boss of the universe. The idea you should get and put down in your notes and get from this cartoon, and put a note that there was a cartoon, is that the leaders of democracy more or less aided Hitler and just allowed him to be. They were just bystanders and allowed him to implement his policies. So soon after, Hitler ordered a program of rearming Germany. This violated the Treaty of Versailles, which said Germany needed to disarm. Hitler's visiting a factory here in this image at the right. He's enthusiastically greeted. The Germans were grateful for jobs, so rearming the country created jobs, which, in the Depression years was a positive thing. And he put a great deal of his people to the effort of rearming Germany and preparing for war. In March 1936, German troops march into the Rhineland. Again, that's the region between Germany and France. They are essentially preparing for war and protecting the borders. So the Rhineland is a region on the border of Germany and France. It's demilitarized after the Treaty of Versailles by mandate. And Germany was not allowed to have troops in the region, but they did. So Hitler's actions shown that he was willing to directly challenge the Treaty of Versailles. It should have been a warning to the other leaders of Europe. March 1938, Germany annexes Austria. So again, this goes against the Treaty of Versailles, which banned Germany and Austria uniting. They were torn apart after the Treaty of Versailles. However, German troops in Austria was met with great enthusiasm. The Austrian people did not resist this occupation. So it was very easy for Hitler to do. There was no violence included. March 1939, Germany invades Czechoslovakia. So we learned that due to appeasement, Czechoslovakia had to give up the Sudetenland. So Hitler had already gotten the Sudetenland in the Munich Agreement in October 1938. This was given permission to him by Britain and France. However, in March 1939, but a few months later, he goes in and conquers the rest of Czechoslovakia. This is his first true act of aggression to suggest that war was inevitable. Yes. In August 1939, shortly after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Germany and Russia signed a non-aggression pact. So this is the one referred to in your homework lecture over the weekend. And so this pact promised that neither country would attack the other in event of war, that they would not mobilize against each other. This should remind you of World War I, when, as soon as Germany acted aggressively, Russia responded to protect Serbia's states. As part of this deal, Hitler promised Stalin part of Poland, which he shared openly that he soon planned to invade. Hitler did not want Stalin to act aggressively when he invaded Poland, and that was the reason for the Hitler never planned to honor this agreement, and Stalin was aware of that, but both of them needed to buy time. You'll notice a lot of these agreements are all about buying time for improving arms. So in September 1939, a month later, Germany invades Poland. This non-aggression pact with Stalin allowed Germany to march into Poland without worrying about Russian retaliation or Russian paranoia. Britain and France reluctantly declared war on Germany. They knew that Hitler's aggression could not be stopped. Appeasement was not going to work. May 1940, Germany turned west and invaded France and the Netherlands. They used blitzkrieg, which is an idea of lightning war, moving very quickly using planes and dropping bombs. So the idea is a rapid attack on enemy territory using tanks, backup infantry, and support from fighter aircrafts. Essentially, you'd send the aircrafts in first to begin the bombing, and then tanks and infantry after. So the aircraft would take out initial threats, tanks and infantry, which are foot soldiers, would follow up. German troops targeted civilian populations. This should stick out to you or sound an alarm. That civilian populations, not armed peoples, were being targeted if they refused to give in to Nazi power. If you speak to anyone who lives in France today, they are very frustrated with themselves and regretful that they immediately surrendered because of this and ceased and gave up their dues to Hitler without offering much resistance. By June 1940, notice May-June, a month later, France had surrendered. So France put up almost no resistance. They had weak leadership. They had a demoralized civilian population. Remember, they were the most affected by the battles of World War I. They had no defense against blitzkrieg. They did not have anti-aircraft missiles. And Britain then stands as the only surviving Western democracy. So in all of Europe, Britain is the only remaining democracy. This puts America on alarm. Hitler marches into France. He actually wanted to have it bombed. One of his generals, though, said he couldn't do that it was too historic and beautiful. So thanks to one of Hitler's generals, Paris was not bombed. Additionally, Hitler was a great fan of art, so he had a lot of the art in France taken back to Germany and distributed among his top soldiers. By September 1940 to May 1941, the following year, there was a blitz on Britain. So for months, the following 9 months, the German Air Force, or the Luftwaffe, launched repeated bombing air raids on British towns and cities. This is when the term keep calm and carry on came to be known. The British all had to have a curfew. They had to have blackout curtains so that planes, because they were bombing by sight, they didn't have fancy radars, so they would look for the lit up villages and bomb them. And so we had to develop counter systems of blackout curtains and curfews. And the message from the Crown was keep calm and carry on. It will be okay. Go to your air raid shelter. Do not worry. So this was known as the Blitz and was an attempt to bomb Britain into submission, to surrender. Hint, hint, somebody comes and saves the day. So we have Operation Barbarossa in 1941. In May 1941, Hitler orders a change of tactics. He stops this intensive bombing on Britain. Instead, he decides to turn to the West and break his pact with Stalin and try to invade Russia. If you remember anything from the last 100 or 1,500 years, it should be that invading Russia is always a failed mission, unless you're the Mongols. So he betrayed Stalin and ignored the promises he had made. This is a bold move and an important turning point in the war. Remember, at this point, Britain is the only last standing democracy in Europe. And there you see the Germans retreating, but 2 years later. So the rules are never invade Russia. Soviet forces, although not super skilled, refused to surrender, and they retreated east. They kept going further and further east. Germans were unprepared for the Russian winter, so the Russians had to follow them deeper and deeper into Russia. And Russians were used to these conditions, and it was to their advantage. While the Russian soldiers were weak, they were experiencing frostbite, etc., running out of food, the Russian soldiers attacked. So they avenged the mass killings and brutal treatment of Slavic peoples by the Nazis. Remember, the Nazis have taken over much of Eastern Europe and the USSR. And so tens and thousands of citizens, civilians, regular people, participated in guerrilla warfare against the Germans. This was a total war. You didn't have just soldiers fighting the Germans out of Russia. Every member of the Russian society was on board. So Soviet forces are able to clear Germans from Russia by 1944, and this is a turning point of weakening of the German army. So a distinguished historian once noted, Americans have this notion of themselves as the sole conqueror of Nazi fascism. The fact is, the demise of Nazism was ensured not by American invasions from North Africa and Britain, but by the blood and sacrifice of another totalitarian state. You should make note in your notes what that totalitarian state was. Put this in your own words in your notes. Use evidence and explain whether you agree or disagree with this statement. Okay, so meanwhile, this whole time, because we've already gotten to 1944, again, the war's been going on 5 years now, Hitler has a final solution. So he's already been removing and separating Jews from society, but in 1942, he shifts his strategy to total destruction. So destruction, not removal, of the Jewish people becomes official policy. This was not advertised to the German people. It was kept secret among the German officials and German army. But the more the war turned against Hitler, the more aggressive he became against his attack on Jews and other desirables, so Catholics, gypsies, homosexuals, communists, etc. And so resources were taken from battle, trains, soldiers, etc., were taken from the battle scene in order to transport, imprison, and commit mass murder against the Jews. So in a way, Hitler's treatment of the Jews was destructive to his military mission. So we have our concentration camps. You can see here the rows in which the Jews were forced to live and sleep. We have our famous slogan, Arbeit macht frei, which means work makes you free, at the entrance to the concentration camps, and the mass death graves. I think it's important to note that to the German people, the propaganda was that these camps were pretty comfortable. They had swimming pools, so they would send out propaganda videos where there were full swimming pools. They found the healthiest Jews to be swimming with their families, looking happy, when in reality, those swimming pools were never actually used, and treatment was horrific. But this was not widely advertised to the German people, and definitely the extermination plan was not either. So the United States, here we are. Before entry into the war, the U.S. was providing supplies to Britain's war effort. This should sound incredibly familiar. History tends to repeat itself. And then we have a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, which pulls the U.S. into the war. You might be familiar, but the Japanese trained kamikaze pilots. They didn't have enough fuel to get from Japan to Hawaii and back. And so the plan all along was to first bomb Pearl Harbor and then fly planes into ships. And so all of the the Japanese soldiers that partook knew they would not be making the return trip home. Instead, they were using their planes as weapons as well. This was during a holiday, and the U.S. was caught completely off guard. So U.S. troops were significant, and we joined the war. And U.S. troops were significant in battles in North Africa, because remember, this is a world war, and Europe has colonies in North Africa, and in the Mediterranean. We then stormed Normandy on D-Day and freed France. We had the Battle of the Bulge, which took place between the territory of into Germany and around Poland. And then Germany's last major effort against the Allies was the Battle of the Bulge. So World War II comes to an end. Hitler, as the Americans are approaching Berlin, they're miles outside of Berlin, he first shoots his used-to-be girlfriend, just recent wife, they just got married, shoots her and commits suicide himself. 2 weeks later, German military leaders surrender. Again, this is a formality. The U.S. has already conquered Berlin and the rest of Germany. And then to the left, you see Mussolini is killed. He's hung in public in front of all his people. And the Nazis actually step in and control northern France. In April of 1945, American and Russian troops complete the final invasion of Germany. I said Italy? France? Oh, the Nazis control northern Italy, pardon me, since Mussolini has been killed and taken from power. So everyone thinks that the war ended when Hitler committed suicide and the Germans surrendered, but actually it continued on for several months in the Pacific. So Japan did not give up. They were still fighting pretty strong. Japan had built a large empire throughout the Pacific. They didn't want to give it up in the Philippines, Korea, etc. In many cases, their role was much more oppressive than previous Western colonizers. Vietnam, for example, was fighting for independence from the French regime, but once Japan steps in, as we read with the communist documents, Japan is extremely brutal to citizens of countries it conquers. So local resistance often distracted the Japanese troops and the Japanese supplies from the larger conflict against the United States. And so the U.S. wins several battles, the Coral Sea, Midway Island, and then it is time to think about using the atomic bomb. We want the war to be over, and we also, quite frankly, aren't totally sure of the military capability of the atomic bomb. We've tested it in the desert, but never seen the actual lasting effects. So we think it might be a good time to try it out. And so the Japanese surrender only comes after we bomb Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I think it's important to note that Nagasaki was one of the only ports that never opened to Western trade, so we were not damaging our own trade with Japan, and it was not militarized, Nagasaki. The clouds were too heavy. We didn't originally intend to bomb Nagasaki, but the weather was too poor, and it was the only village or city we could see, and so we ended up bombing it. Here you see the effects, which were incredibly destructive. Upper left is a mushroom cloud from an atomic bomb. The blast radius just of heat is over 1 mile wide. So whether or not there's actual fire, the heat is so strong that people were getting third-degree burns, like this woman you can see on the right-hand side, and then radiation spread for miles and miles beyond that. In the lower left is someone in one of the main cities who is essentially incinerated and just a shell was left over. And then on the right, you can see how much the city was razed and completely destroyed. Radiation and after effects left the cities rebuilding for years. They could not be re-inhabited. So the atomic bomb was much more destructive than we had originally thought. And we'll talk about this, but it's going to change the structure of global politics.